what does it take to make an action game which is really juicy and crunchy and, in other words, feels good to play and makes people want to play it over and over again? Well, the game that we're looking at today is going to help us think through some of those criteria of what makes a good action game. So whether you're a developer yourself or you're just a fan of games who loves seeing how games are made and hearing people talk about game design as a topic, there's going to be a lot here for you as we look at today's game, Wispy Dreams, some of the design decisions that make this a really solid game, in my opinion, and some of the design decisions that I would question and maybe suggest to the developer to rethink. I haven't seen a game like this in years. It's sort of playing off of the old single-screen platformer genre that doesn't really exist anymore, of games like Rainbow Islands and Bubble Bobble. I suppose the only thing that I know from indie games that sort of falls in this category at all would be something like Towerfall, and even then that's a kind of player versus player game. So this is quite an unusual thing to see, and I think it does some interesting innovative things with that format, which are slightly better than just putting enemies in bubbles and way better than shooting rainbows that make a really annoying sound. Like in Wispy Dreams, you play a small creature with big red shoes on that goes around kicking other creatures to death. Or it's not really to death though, because they kind of neutralize and become little friendly versions of themselves. But it still feels quite brutal nonetheless. And part of that is due to the fact that the sort of physics-based catapult nature of this kick has you launching enemies around the level and bouncing off of each other and kind of causing more hurt and mischief the more they bounce. And it's also got some really satisfying sound design along with it, and I think that's really important to point out at the start here, because I see a lot of action games where the developer has gone and kind of got interested in adding all these new features and all that kind of stuff, and the kind of feel of the basic, you know, attacking and hurting an enemy, or the feel of being hurt and, you know, knowing when your character has been hurt is quite poor. And this game has really nailed that aspect of kind of juicy, crunchy game feel. Another thing that I think is really interesting about Wispy Dreams is that when you've finished a level, i.e. when you've beaten up all of the creatures in a level, you get this weird little physics puzzle where you have to find the gear in the level and kick it onto this machine. And I'm not entirely sure what that's meant to mean in terms of theme and story, but it's a satisfying way of ending a level, and it felt quite similar to what they used to do in Mario, where you had to kind of like jump up and hit the flagpole. It was kind of adding that to it. And it also shows that the developer is thinking of different ways of using their core mechanics. And this could be a really helpful exercise to do if you're making an action game in particular, is if you've got a core interaction mechanic like kick, push, throw, whatever it is, have a think about how many different types of interaction you can get out of that. So if you, I know it's not an indie game, but if you look at Fall Guys, for example, the player has a very limited palette of actions in that game. They can jump, they can slide on their belly, and they can grab hold of things. But that grab action in Fall Guys can be used in so many different ways. It can be used to pick things up and hold them above your head, stop other people getting them. It can be used to grab someone else. There are loads of different nouns that verb can be used on. So one of the things I like about this game is that the core action, the main gameplay verb of kicking, feels really good when you do it to enemies, and also enemies aren't the only things you can do it to. So if you're working on action games, take note of that. Think about what the verbs you're giving players to do are. And instead of adding loads and loads and loads of content to your game, like loads of levels, loads of different enemy types, think about adding more interactions between the verbs you have and the nouns you have. I know that's quite abstract. I know that might be difficult for you to apply to a different sort of game. But if you're making a game where you can pick up and throw things, for example, what are the additional ways of doing picking up and throwing, or throwing different things, or throwing things at different things that you maybe haven't explored? Because this game does this really well. You're not just kicking enemies, you're kicking enemies around, repositioning them, kicking them into each other. And that makes the action feel really satisfying, and it kind of makes it feel very skill-based, because you can effectively just go around and kick each of these enemies once and not think at all about where they're going or the directionality of that or any of that stuff. But you can also play this much more kind of skill-based version of this game where you're deliberately trying to hit things into other things. And by having the option to do that, and by making it optional, what the developer's done is make a game that is not super hardcore difficult for a beginner, but where you can sort of ramp up the skill by trying to do harder stuff yourself. So they sort of happened upon something really nice with that. Now, there are a few presentational things here that I don't like, but they're not necessarily big things. Like the text, this kind of curly hand-drawn text, it's very decorative, but a lot of the time I'm not really sure what it's trying to do. It just kind of hurts the legibility of the text. Kind of looks fancy, but I'm not sure if it fits in with this world. And then there are some places in the background art where there are very thick outlines, and that makes certain things look more prominent or important than they should do. Normally, if I was trying to make something in this 2D art style with outlines, I would reserve the kind of darker, thicker outlines for things that are in the foreground, things that are important, things that have collision on them, not for anything in the background decoration. These are all relatively small things. From a larger thematic point of view, I had a bit of an issue with the enemies, and I know that ultimately this is a cute game, everything's supposed to be cute, and it kind of does the Sonic the Hedgehog thing of you beat up a bad guy and then they turn into a good guy, right? Which is what Sonic did. They were like roboticized enemies, and you're beating them up to save the real animals that are trapped inside, right? And this does a similar thing. You beat these grumpy animals into submission, and then their grumpy eyes go away and they shrink down to a little cute toy version, or, you know, just a more subdued version of themselves. And that's okay, but the contrast between those two states is not quite as large as it might be in something like Sonic. And what that does, or at least for me, and maybe I've just got a sick mind, but it kind of made the theme of the game feel a bit like you're just going into areas where there are wild animals, and those animals are annoyed because you're invading their space, and then you kick them until they go to sleep and maybe don't wake up anymore. The cuteness of the enemies made the game feel a bit mean-spirited, especially because the player character is doing this kind of awesome, cool, aggressive face when they do a kick. Makes it feel like I'm going around bullying small animals, which I'm sure there is a market for that sort of game, but I'm not sure if that's what this is intending to be. The first boss is really nicely designed. They kind of shoot out these little clouds, and again, you're using the kick mechanic to send them back. So if you've mastered in the previous levels or rounds, if you've mastered that ability to kick things at other things that are moving, then this boss is testing that skill. So there is a real sense of the game's going to teach you a skill, and then you're going to have to use it in various different ways, which is exactly what I want from this kind of action game. In the second area of the game, I chose to go into a fire level. There were options. I could do ice or fire. And at one point I got a power-up that was very similar to the bubbles from Puzzle Bubble, which was a nice touch. So I don't know what else there is there in terms of these kind of power-ups, but the game did keep throwing things at me to show me that there was more there. For example, I was collecting letters and they spelt out zinc. I don't know why zinc was a scoring thing. Maybe it's a character's name or something, but that wasn't unclear. But I didn't care because I was getting points and collecting different types of things, and that made me feel inherently happy. Overall, I don't have loads to say about this game because I think it's really solid at what it's doing. You're gonna probably like or dislike the art style based on how you feel about My Little Pony, because it's that art style, but I think this game is really worth a look at, particularly if you frequently play games with someone else on the same machine. Like if you've got someone that you play things like Overcooked with, that you play single screen co-op games with, then if you see this game out and about, I would definitely check it out, because there is just something very funny about this kind of slapstick kicking that I think is going to be even funnier if you play it with the right person. So yeah, that's Wispy Dreams. If you're new to my channel, please do take a moment to subscribe. I try and do one of these design breakdowns of an indie game work in progress at least once a week, and sometimes I do other content like just general design theory about games or reviews of other types of indie games that are already released. So if you found any of this interesting and useful, then subscribe to the channel and take a look at some of the videos that come up here in a moment, because I will have handpicked these to appeal to you based on what I think you want, based on the video you just watched. I hope I'm making sense. In the meantime, treat animals nicely, and I hope you have sweet dreams and collect lots of letters that spell out a nice word. Good night.